And on behalf of the organizing team of this workshop, let me welcome you today, this morning, to rainy Oregon. And I hope you have had a good time here so far after you arrived. I know some of you travel very far away from Vietnam, from Australia, from England, from Germany. I know some of you missed your flights because of the typhoon in Tokyo, like Jason over there, my friend, and had to be rerouted and took a long time to get here. So I really appreciate your efforts. And you know what? You know, it rained here on Saturday, and according to the weather forecast, it's going to rain on Wednesday when you guys leave. So thanks a lot for bringing the sunlight here to Oregon. But as an organizer of the workshop, I was really surprised at the enthusiastic responses to our call for papers that I sent out in February. From senior scholars to graduate students, including many scholars from Vietnam. And you would assume that this topic is sensitive and even a taboo in Vietnam. But the presence of at least 7 scholars from Vietnam here today suggests that scholarly interest in the topic is quite strong, despite the sensitiveness of the topic. So thank you all to the scholars and researchers for your participation. I look forward to hearing about your latest findings in your research in the next 2 days. But I was also surprised by the outpouring of interest and support from the Vietnamese diasporic community and the media. You know what? We did not solicit media coverage of this event, but there's a lot of media present today in this room, and I know the VOA, the RFA, Người Việt newspaper, and SBTN TV perhaps has someone here as well. That's kind of the evidence of how kind of the enthusiasm from the community about this event that we're having today. But I also would like to, before we proceed, to acknowledge a few guests, special guests, who, some of whom we did not invite, but came here on their own initiatives, but, who are prominent in the community and are relevant to our topic today, and I would like to introduce them. First, Mr. Phạm Kim Ngọc, sitting in the back over there. He's 92 years old, and came all the way from Saigon. And he was Minister of Economy in the most critical period of the Vietnam War from 1967 to 1973 or 74, I believe. And I just learned 2 days ago that his aunt, who is the sister of his father, was married to the novelist Nhất Linh Nguyễn Tường Tam. And so Mr. Nguyễn Tường Tam, Nhất Linh, spent the last few months of his life hiding from the government on the top floor of the building of the house of his father, and there was where he completed his last manuscript and wrote and committed suicide, as we know. So that's how Mr. Ngọc is relevant to this conference. And I also want to recognize Mr. and Mrs. Nguyễn Tường Thiết, sitting over there, who came from Seattle, not so far away, and he's the son of Mr. Nguyễn Tường Tam, Nhất Linh, and he's the only son of the writer who continued to write, to follow in the father's footsteps. I would like to recognize Dr. Judith Henchey, who is the head of the Southeast Asian Library section at the University of Washington, and the manager of the VSG listserv. I would like to recognize Professor Trần Quang Minh, who was Deputy Minister of Agriculture in South Vietnam. And I would like to recognize Miss Nancy Bui, who's sitting over there, who's the founder and president of Vietnamese American Heritage Foundation, who is responsible for carrying out a lot of the oral history work, a big project that you could see on exhibition over there along the wall. And the VAHF has supported us to create a new project on the legacy of the Republic of Vietnam, the history of Vietnamese Americans that we are starting this fall with the help of the freshly minted Dr. Alex Tybor, who just defended his dissertation a few days ago. I would like to recognize Dr. Nguyễn Đình Thắng over there, who's could you stand? Yeah, who's the president and CEO of BPSOS, who's supporting us together with other friends to create a new center for U.S.-Vietnam research. We just launched the website, and we start to work on this soon. And we want to do research on contemporary Vietnamese politics and society. We also want to study U.S.-Vietnam relations and Vietnamese Americans as well. So that's my recognition of the special guests that we have today. Now, I'm supposed to start at 8, but we started a bit late, so I hope you could wait for a few more minutes. Yeah, I just go quickly through my presentation, which is first about the history of this conference. So I was lucky to be invited to this symposium, Voices from the South at Cornell in 2012. The symposium was organized by Professor Keith Taylor of Cornell University, who's in the room over there, and Professor Keith Taylor assembled a group of 10 or 15 prominent leaders of the Republic of Vietnam to Cornell. And I think that's the first time in decades that you had that kind of group of people, appearing in a public place with, and treated it with in a respectful manner. So Professor Taylor set the example as a senior scholar, and I follow. And so in 2016, I approached Professor Peter Zimmerman, sitting there, to co-organize this symposium at Berkeley on nation building in war, the Republican experience from 1955 to 1975. And we also assembled a group of prominent RVN figures, but not just the military and political leaders, but also the writers, the actors, the educators, the journalists. And there were a group of 6 or 7 scholars who presented at this conference as well. So I want to acknowledge my debt to Professor Zimmerman, who has always supported my dangerous ideas, beginning with my dissertation. And before I just have a few slides left on the confusing concepts that I'm sure, in the next 2 days, we're going to talk about this a lot. And, I have to deal with these issues as I prepare for this conference. What does it mean to say we want to study Republican Vietnam? What does that mean? What does that term mean? How do you translate the term Republicanism into Vietnamese, for example? Because I think I'm probably the third person who has ever used this term Republican Vietnam. I think you're one of the first, and then Chris Gosha is another person. Maybe I'm wrong. But that the term has not been used at all. Compared to Republican China, for example, right? So we just don't have that term. So when we propose the agenda for this workshop, I want to think about this concept. What do we mean by it, and how do you translate it, and what's the difference between republicanism and communism? Because we're going to run into that eventually, right? But we have to start with a very basic definition of what a republic is, and this is. The concept itself, began in the Roman Empire, right? And then it was resurrected in the French during the French Revolution, and the meaning continued to evolve. So that like every country today, almost every country, call themselves a republic. But then back in the 19th century, it was meant as a form of government. With popular sovereignty rest with the people. Sovereignty rests with the people, not with the monarch, right? So that's kind of the essential meaning of a republic in opposition to a monarchy, right? Which was the most common form of government at the time. And also the thinkers of Republican ideas also, thought about, like how popular sovereignty could be institutionalized in the Constitution and laws. The constitutions and laws are very important for, definition of a republic because, they constrain the arbitrary power of the rulers, right? So that's why the promoters of new republics wanted. But then, by the time of Han Chou-jin, he actually defined a republic as a democracy, as you could see that quote from his famous writing Quân trị chủ nghĩa and Dân trị chủ nghĩa back in 1925. So he's defining a republic as a democracy because without the constitution, without the laws, then how can the popular sovereignty be realized, right? So you have the abstract concept of how popular sovereignty, but you need the laws and the constitution to hold the rulers accountable to the people. Now let's turn to Republican Vietnam, which is the concept that that we use for our workshop today. So I think there are two ways to define it, and the way to separate the two is to capitalize the R or not capitalize the R. Right? So if you use Republican Vietnam with the capitalized R, that refers to the Republic of Vietnam period as a historical period limited in time from 1955 to 1975 and limited in space, right, from 17 parallel down. And the parallel would be Republican China, right? But if we use Republican Vietnam with the small r, then it could mean a lot more things, right? So it could mean Vietnamese republicanism, Republican Vietnam plus Republican values, Republican ideas, Republican institutions, including the collective memories of the diaspora itself. How to translate Republicanism into Vietnamese? I was just proposing a list of terms that go from the broadest to the narrowest, from xu hướng từ hình thái chính trị cộng hòa, thể chế chế độ cộng hòa, chủ nghĩa cộng hòa, tư tưởng cộng hòa, giá trị cộng hòa, căn cước bản sắc cộng hòa. These are the terms that I hope that we can start using if we talk about what it means to, about these Republican ideas and how do we translate them into Vietnamese. And finally, this is a big topic that I don't have time. It's the last slide. It's just contrasting Republicanism and communism. Right, so these are, we've heard a lot about communism, and basically, as you see from the list, the communist or communism is a lot more radical, right? They don't just oppose colonial rule, they oppose imperialism, right? Imperialism refers to global imperialism, not just the colonization of Vietnam. So they go a lot farther than republicanism. They don't just oppose monarchs, right? They oppose landlords as well, who form together in their thinking, form the feudal system that they opposed. They were a lot more radical than simply republicanism. They were not just anti the clergy or clerical power, They were anti-religion as a concept, right? As a tool that they think as religion is a tool of the bourgeois, right? The opiate of the masses. So they are anti-religion, not just anti the clergy, which is a lot more radical than republicanism. And finally, they don't have this idea of the Constitution and the laws being important, but they have this. They don't have this idea of the legal order as important, right? We know that in Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh government dissolved the law school back in 1948 because the lawyers were trying to hold them accountable to their policies. So they dissolved the law school, and not until like the 1980s when Vietnam reopened to the world, when we started to have legal training and the lawyers emerged as a profession. So law is not law also like religion. To the communists is a tool, the bourgeois tool to oppress the masses, to oppress the lower classes. So and the order, the political order under communism is a class-based order, not a legal order, not a constitutional order. I think that's all the time I have for now. Then let me just turn to Professor Gineman's keynote talk today that we all waiting for. Thank you. So Professor Gineman is currently the chair of the history department and professor of history and Southeast Asian studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's the founding editor of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. You could see some copies of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies over there on exhibition together with his books. And he's the author of The Colonial Bastille, A History of Imprisonment in Vietnam, Vietnamese Colonial Republican, The Political Vision of Vu Trọng Phụng. And he's the co-translator of Dumb Luck, a novel by Vu Trọng Phụng. Please join me to welcome Professor Gineman.
Is that, everyone can hear me? Yeah? Okay. Let me start by just thanking Dung for organizing this workshop and inviting me to give the keynote speech. Dung was my second PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I'm incredibly pleased and proud of the work that he's done since he's left Berkeley, as well as his work there. I also want to thank Holly Lakey and her team for organizing this event and really being super on top of things and easy to work with. And finally, I want to thank everyone here for coming out and listening to me this morning. It's actually a very unusual experience for me to be able to speak to such a learned audience, to talk to people who know the background, who I don't need to explain some sort of the basic background, the basic concepts of what I'm talking about. It's actually very, very unusual, and I really appreciate having this opportunity. Okay, so I will now begin. In two separate senses, the study of modern Vietnamese history today is experiencing something of a Republican moment. It's a Republican moment in the sense that, for the first time, a small but critical mass of scholars is now highlighting the significance for Vietnamese political history of a local Republican tradition with roots in the French colonial encounter and narrow branches that extend up until the present. Derived from an 18th century political impulse that animated the revolutions of 1789 and 1848 and infused the political culture of France's Third Republic from 1870 to 1940, Republicanism celebrated liberty, equality, and fraternity, and promoted democracy, science, education, and the rule of law. Republicanism's most prominent enemies were the twin despotisms of monarchy and the Catholic Church. Given its French pedigree, it's not surprising that early scholarship on republicanism in Vietnam focused on moderately progressive European expats attorneys, newspapermen, and officials. More recent studies have explored Vietnamese republicanism in the Quốc ngữ language press of the colonial era and in the ideological leanings of local activists and intellectuals. In this way, what Oliver Walters might have called the localization of the tradition represents a defining preoccupation of this current Republican moment. A Republican moment in the scholarship in a different sense may also be discerned in a recent upsurge of interest in the post-colonial nation state known as the Republic of Vietnam, or the RVN. Founded as a rival to the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam after the 1954 Geneva Accords, the RVN survived south of the 17th parallel for 2 decades until April of 1975. Led by an elite that had been exposed to Republican political culture during the late colonial era, the RVN establishment grappled with this tradition, even if it did not always respect and honor it. While depictions of the RVN rightly emphasize its authoritarianism, its militarism, and its ill-fated relationship with the US, an enduring Republican impulse south of the 17th parallel may also be observed. It's there in the machinery of democratic government, including elections and legislative politics, as well as in critical aspects of civil society, such as a privately owned press, independent labor unions, autonomous churches, and student activism. None of these manifestations of Republican culture survived in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, of course, and Republican norms there were rarely invoked in public after the suppression of the Nhân dân Giải phóng movement in the late 1950s. In the South, on the other hand, Republicanism was present in many incarnations, including as a standard against which local critics within the RVN appraised their own government. While scholars are now exploring both the Republic of Vietnam and the broader Vietnamese Republican political tradition, the same cannot be said for journalists and popular writers. Indeed, one of the most striking features in the broader discourse on modern Vietnamese history is the disconnect between academic and non-academic interpretations of many topics, including this two-headed Republican theme. This is going to be the basic subject of my talk today. Before exploring the rise of this theme and the divergent approach towards it adopted in scholarship on the one hand and popular discourse on the other, its novelty deserves note. It is instructive that the terms republic or republicanism do not appear in the indexes of the 3 most important English language works of colonial-era Vietnamese intellectual history: Alexander Woodside's Community and Revolution in Vietnam, published in 1976, David Marr's Vietnamese Tradition on Trial, published in 1980, and Huy Tam Ho Thai's Radicalism and the Origins of the Vietnamese Revolution, published in 1992. So it's a work in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Nor do they appear, the terms republic or republicanism, as items in the index of standard academic political histories of the late colonial era, such as William Diker's The Rise of Nationalism in Vietnam, or Huynh Kim Kine's Vietnamese Communism. During the same era, the most important French historians of Vietnam, such as Bernard Fall, Georges Boudarel, and Pierre Brocheux, exhibited a similar scant interest in Vietnamese republicanism. Among the first foreign scholars to look at the topic seriously were historians of the French Empire, such as J.P. Doughton, Eric Jennings, and Martin Thomas, who started to address it in the early 2000s. Cognizant of debates over the link between French republicanism and French imperialism involving scholars such as Alice Conklin and Gary Wilder, these scholars explored Republican impulses animating the imperial project in French Indochina, especially in their interaction with republicanism's traditional enemies, the political right and the Catholic Church. During this era, French scholars, including Agathe Gaucha, worked in a similar vein, teasing out the Republican agenda of progressive or moderately progressive colonial officials such as Paul Bot, Albert Sarraut, and Alexandre Varenne. The agenda of this new work went against the grain of an older scholarship that treated the ideology of French imperialism in a cruder and more undifferentiated fashion. The older scholarship emphasized overlap between the interests and perspectives of French missionaries and secular French officials. The new scholarship highlighted dissension between the two groups and traced these conflicts to ideological differences that had long divided Republicans and their enemies in the metropole. The earliest efforts to explore Republican ideas in Vietnamese, as opposed to French intellectual life in Indochina, focus, as Dung said in his introduction, on the patriotic Confucian scholar Phan Chu Trinh. Quote, Phan Chu Trinh started a reformist movement whose more radical aim was a democratic republic, wrote Joseph Buttinger in 1967. Although still dedicated to revolutionary action in 1912, Phan Chu Trinh had to give in to the now dominant Republican trend in the national resistance movement, unquote. Despite the provocative nature of this claim that a Republican trend dominated the Vietnamese national movement in the early 20th century, Buttinger never pursued it further, nor does he examine in any detail the Republican content of Phan Chu Trinh writings. In 2009, 42 years later, Vinh Singh published the first serious study of this topic in a volume entitled Phan Chu Trinh and His Political Writing. It located Phan Chu Trinh republicanism in his strong support for popular rights, Dân Quyền, democracy, Dân Chủ, and self-rule, Đức Trị, and in his equally full-throated hostility to monarchy and autocracy. It's notable that despite the unmistakable Republican language cited by Vinh Singh, earlier interpretations of Phan Chu Trinh highlighted other influences in his political thought. Both Woodside and Marr emphasized his Confucian orientation, and touted his significance as a nationalist more than as a radical Republican. They also dwelled upon his pacifism and his reformism, familiar preoccupations of Vietnamese communist scholarship. Where Phan Chu Trinh Republican instincts were most apparent, according to this earlier scholarship, was in his contempt for the Vietnamese monarchy and his call for its abolition. To be fair, Marr also mentioned Phan Chu Trinh rhetorical commitment to, quote, the high ideals of the French Revolution, unquote, but he never uses the term Republican to describe Phan Chu Trinh. The Vinh Singh volume from 2009 was followed by 3 books that both used the term and dwelled upon the significance of the Republican tradition in colonial Vietnam. The first, by Philip K. Cam, started as a PhD dissertation at SOAS, supervised by the late, great Ralph Smith. A history of Southern Vietnamese newspapers during the 1920s. It was published in 2012 as, under the title, The Birth of Vietnamese Political Journalism, 1916 to 1930. In a chapter called French Republicanism and the Emergence of Saigon's Public Sphere, this book argues for the great impact of republicanism on Vietnamese political culture during the era. Just 2 years later, in 2014, I released my monograph on the Northern Vietnamese writer Vu Trong Phom, entitled Vietnamese Colonial Republican, The Political Vision of Vu Trong Phom. In it, I argue that Vietnam's greatest modern writer expressed a strong Republican vision, even if his preferred forms of expression, fiction and first-person reportage, prevented him from releasing anything like a manifesto on this topic. What I call a late Republican vision in Vu Trong Phom's writing may be discerned in his opposition to unbridled capitalism, in his disapproval of communist despotism, in his sympathy for the underdog, and in his strong advocacy for science, education, freedom of expression, the rule of law, and the welfare state. The label fits further, I suggest, because Vu Trong Phom's literary heroes, Hugo and Zola, were both giants of literary republicanism. Although I don't develop this point systematically, I also point out that many elements of Vu Trong Phom's Republican sensibility were shared by friends and colleagues, like Phan Hoi, Lan Khai, and Ngo That Do, who, like him, wrote for the Dun Dun publishing house during the era. Like these popular figures, Vu Trong Phom was an influencer, and perhaps even a barometer that tracked changes in certain sectors of public opinion. In a final chapter of the book, I argue that the posthumous promotion of Vu Trong Phom by members of the Nhân Văn Giải Phóng group during the late 1950s might be seen as evidence for the persistence of this tradition among a subsection of DRV intellectuals. In 2012, my student Martina Nguyen submitted a dazzling dissertation that argued persuasively that Nhật Linh and the hugely influential Self-Strength literary group, contemporaries and rivals of Vu Trong Phom, also expressed a strong Republican vision in their work. The third recent book to foreground the role of republicanism in modern Vietnamese history is Christopher Gosha's The Penguin History of Modern Vietnam, published in 1917. The theme is introduced in early chapters that link the late 19th century imperial conquest to the rise to power in France of fervently Republican politicians. These chapters also locate a Republican impulse in the efforts of ambitious colonial officials such as Paul Doumer and Albert Sarraut to strengthen and centralize the colonial state and to reform in a moderately progressive direction colonial policy and practice. The localization of the Republican tradition is the subject of Chapter 5, entitled The Failure of Colonial Republicanism in Vietnam. Following Vinh Sinh, Gosha highlights Phan Chu Trinh support for Republican ideals such as the rights of man and representative government. Pursuing the theme further, he refers to Phan Chu Trinh 1907 open letter to Paul Bot as a Vietnamese j'accuse. This refers to Émile Zola's famous declaration on the Dreyfus Affair, a quintessential expression of early 20th century Republican values. Gosha makes the provocative point that Ho Chi Minh's famous claims of the Vietnamese people, sent to the American Secretary of State at the Paris peace talks in 1919, focused on Republican reforms, not on communism or independence. After World War I, a local republicanism was energized further, climaxing with the program of Governor General Sarraut, which included enhanced support for education, democracy, state centralization, judicial reform, anti-corruption, and the vernacular language press. Sarraut's reform found support among reform-minded Vietnamese who Gosha argues, quote, bet on colonial republicanism. People like Nguyen Van Vinh, Bui Quang Chiu, Nguyen Phu Khai, and Quyen Thu Cang. These figures are not normally lumped together under this label in the scholarship. Moving into the 1920s, Gosha describes a strain of Republican reformism focused on attaining political representation for a new bourgeoisie, led by people like Dung Van Zau and Nguyen Phan Long. The appearance of, quote, the most prominent Vietnamese Republican, according to Gosha, the brilliant journalist and political activist Nguyen An Ninh, reflected the growth of a new strain of youth-oriented republicanism, also associated with Nguyen Thai Hau and the militant Vietnam Quốc Dân Đảng. Gosha sees France's mistreatment of the constitutionalists as the foolish repression of a moderate republicanism that, if left alone, may have evolved in the non-communist direction of India's Congress Party. But France's heavy-handed overreaction to the party left bourgeois Republicans in a, quote, stillborn state, inadvertently providing a boost to the local Stalinists. Compared to previous general histories of the country, it's striking how large republicanism looms in Gosha's understanding of the political dynamics of the colonial era. Since Gosha's texts will likely remain the standard historical survey for the modern period for the foreseeable future, his engagement with republicanism may encourage further interest in the topic. The belatedness of this development, however, begs an obvious question. Why has Vietnamese republicanism only become an object of study in the last decade? I think there's three reasons worth contemplating. One is that few colonial-era Vietnamese self-identified as followers of Chủ nghĩa Cộng hòa, the most common term for republicanism, at least according to Dao Duy Ain's respected 1931 dictionary. Perhaps because of its earlier association with imperial expansion, the term was never embraced by Vietnamese activists in the same spirit as labels such as communist, socialist, anarchist, Stalinist, Trotskyist, constitutionalist, or nationalist, all terms by which people referred to themselves during this era. Hence, proponents of the significance of colonial republicanism, including myself, must acknowledge questions raised about this thesis by the relative obscurity of the term during the era. A second reason for the neglect of republicanism prior to this decade is the impact of the Vietnam War on the scholarship. During the conflict, left-leaning anti-war proponents of what becomes the orthodox school disparaged the shallow ideologies of non-communist political alternatives. Compared to the Marxist clarity of Ho Chi Minh's movement, the political ideology of both his colonial-era rivals and successive post-colonial RVN regimes was hopelessly murky and or reactionary. In cases in which a non-communist political orientation was obviously apparent, as, say, with constitutionalism during the interwar era or personalism of the late 1950s, early 60s, Orthodox scholars tended to belittle them as inauthentic, incoherent, and ineffectual. The DRV had an ideology, according to Orthodox scholars, but the RVN did not, unless one counts a slavishly pro-American anti-communism. For Orthodox scholars, the superficiality of ideology in the RVN damaged its political legitimacy, especially compared to its communist rival to the north. To the extent that Orthodox scholars characterized RVN regimes ideologically, they relied on negative labels such as authoritarianism, militarism, or even fascism. In this context, a political orientation such as Republicanism featured too many positive connotations to be useful to the budding Orthodox school, which crafted its historical arguments with an eye towards their potential utility in the rhetorical conflict over the war. This leads to a third reason for the recent rise of interest in the topic, a generational shift among scholars towards what we might think of as a post-war perspective on the history of the country. It's probably no coincidence that the three scholars who have pushed the Republican theme the hardest in the last decade, Pekam, Gosha, and myself, are all in our 50s and were children when the Vietnam War came to an end. As a result, the only Vietnam that we know personally is the authoritarian and repressive socialist republic. Rather than knocking the ideas of non-communist nationalists, we are, like many local intellectuals and democracy advocates, more interested in puncturing the myths of communist historiography and exploring political roads not taken during what is often presented as the inevitable rise to dominance of Ho Chi Minh's communists. While a local Republican tradition has started to loom large in academic histories of modern Vietnam, it has yet to make a dent in more popular discourse about the country's past. Perhaps the best example is the hugely influential Ken Burns' Lynn Novick documentary, The Vietnam War, which ignores the tradition in its treatment of the colonial origins of the conflict. Instead, as I explained in much greater detail in a recent essay on the H-Diplo website, Burns and Novick advanced the thoroughly misleading thesis that Ho Chi Minh's Communist Party was the only serious anti-colonial force in the country prior to World War II. This specious argument allows the filmmakers to highlight a kind of loaded contrast between the durable and authentic nationalist communist tradition embodied by the DRV and the thin pseudo-nationalism of the RVN, a fake political tradition hastily improvised by American Cold Warriors and their local clients. But like Ho Chi Minh, Ngo Dinh Diem and his successors were also the legatees of older local political traditions, such as colonial republicanism and anti-communist nationalism. This insight is overlooked in the Burns-Novick documentary, which treats the RVN as an American puppet devoid of local roots or history prior to the onset of the Cold War. By failing to acknowledge the colonial-era history of Republican nationalism, the documentary gives the false impression that the RVN was less rooted in the Vietnamese historical experience than the communist DRV, and therefore was less of a legitimate political force. In contrast to the scholarship on Vietnamese republicanism, which appeared only in the last decade, writing on the Southern Republic of Vietnam has been around for several generations. What is relatively new, however, is a recent break in the discourse on the RVN from a harshly negative assessment that first emerged during the 1960s to a more complex and even-handed view that dates, I would say, from the 1990s and early 2000s. During the war, the most influential foreign renderings on the RVN were disparaging depictions by anti-war journalists and academics like Francis Fitzgerald, David Halberstam, and George Cahan. The RVN inspired similar vitriol among the first generation of post-war historians, whether liberals like George Herring and Neil Sheehan, or radicals like Marilyn Young and Gabriel Kolko. For both liberals and radicals, South Vietnam was a puppet of the United States created to stem the spread of communism in Asia. The RVN political leadership was nepotistic and authoritarian, the elite was venal and corrupt, the military was cowardly and incompetent. The RVN also suffered owing to its ideological incoherence. The American presence dampened nationalist sentiment and damaged popular support for the state's anti-communism, which was viewed as an inauthentic foreign import. The culture and society of the RVN also received rough treatment in portrayals that emphasized the growth of prostitution, crime, drug abuse, and social inequality in the cities, and clumsy security initiatives and flawed nation-building programs in the countryside. The problem with these negative representations of the RVN is not that they are wholly untrue. It's rather that they tell only part of the story. They ignore the country's competitive political culture, its freewheeling civil society, its interesting intellectual and cultural life, and the anti-totalitarian idealism of many of its most articulate supporters. They also disregard the relationship between many of the most illiberal features of the RVN and the ruthless, externally supported guerrilla movement arrayed violently against it. What then explains the sharply negative depiction of the RVN that crystallized during this period? Again, I think there's several things to keep in mind. First was a deep disapproval of the American intervention on the part of many scholars and journalists, and a related tendency to romanticize America's enemy and disparage its ally. For observers whose main objective was to hasten an American withdrawal, this tendency made practical political sense. A second factor is that the RVN was largely open to foreign researchers during the era. These outside observers were able to view up close the many ugly aspects of a poor post-colonial society mobilized for civil war. Since the DRV during that era was almost completely off limits to foreigners outside of diplomatic corps and Chinese workers, it avoided a similar level of scrutiny. Finally, portrayals of the RVN produced after the war were undoubtedly shaped by the defeat and ultimately the disappearance of the country as an independent geopolitical entity. Preoccupied with these two massive blots on the RVN's historical record, it is not surprising that scholars during the immediate post-war era fixated upon the roots of these dramatic failures. The past several decades has witnessed the emergence of revisionist scholarship on the RVN. A very early example, I think, was Neil Jameson's 1993 study, Understanding Vietnam, which featured an idiosyncratic but sympathetic ethnography of Southern Vietnamese culture and society during the war. A turning point in the scholarship was achieved by Philip Catton's Diem's Final Failure, Prelude to America's War in Vietnam, published in 2002. It kicked off an important collective effort to revise the reputation of Ngo Dinh Diem and the government that he led between 1954 and 1963. While not uncritical of its subject, as the title of his book indicates, Catton emphasizes the ideological autonomy of the Diem regime and its deeply troubled relationship with the United States. For Catton, Ngo Dinh Diem was nobody's puppet. He argued for the coherence of Ngo Dinh Diem's political project, the roots of which he located in a domestic anti-communist nationalist tradition and progressive social Catholicism. Among the many scholars who followed in Catton's footsteps in pursuit of new perspectives on the Ngo Dinh Diem decade were Jessica Chapman, Olga Dror, Jessica Elkin, Duan Huang, Kevin Lee, Edward Miller, Jason Picard, Jeffrey Stewart, Mitchell Tan, Stan Tan, and Nguyen Tran. Interesting revisionist approaches to the RVN under Ngo Dinh Diem's successors have been carried out by Sean Fear, Vân Nguyen Marshall, Lien Hang Nguyen, Keith Taylor, and Jay Faith. And less dismissive accounts of the Southern Vietnamese Army have been produced by people like Robert Brigham, Natalie Huyen Chung Nguyen, and Andrew Weist. In addition, the rich literature, music, and intellectual life of the RVN has been studied by a growing number of scholars, including Jason Gibbs, Nguyen Vo Tu Hung, Ching Liu, and John Schaefer. But while revisionist interpretations of the RVN are ascendant, I would argue, in the scholarly literature, the same cannot be said for accounts of the war intended for broad public consumption. And this is the same dynamic that we saw with the discourse on republicanism, rising in the scholarship on the one hand, but absent more or less in popular accounts on the other. A good example may be found in Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, first published by Grove Press in 2015. It's safe to assume that many more people will read Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel than all the writing of all the scholars of the Republic of Vietnam combined. A New York Times bestseller, the novel has won 8 literary awards to date, including the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Based on the success of the novel, Viet Thanh Nguyen won a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship and a Guggenheim Award in 2017. Acclaim for the novel has granted him a large public platform that includes regular space on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and Time magazine. Although he addresses many topics in his role as a public intellectual, the Vietnam War, its legacy, and representation remain persistent areas of interest. They sit at the center of his last nonfiction book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. And they represent central themes of The Sympathizer, a novel that opens in Saigon right before its fall to communist forces, and follows a cast of largely Vietnamese characters involved in the war and its contentious aftermath. So how does The Sympathizer portray the Republic of Vietnam? Well, it's a tricky question, since virtually everything in the novel is filtered through the voice and the consciousness of its anonymous narrator, a Franco-Vietnamese double agent loyal to the communists who infiltrates the southern Vietnamese state and society, and later the Vietnamese diaspora community in California. One could argue, to be fair, that everything in the book should be read as the view of its main character, not its author. However, it also feels significant that the narrator of The Sympathizer is relatively vague as a character, and that he expresses interest in a wide range of erudite concerns that more recall a college professor than a spy. Would a spy muse this much on the, quote, politics of representation? I don't think so. Moreover, since the narrator's view is the only one offered in the novel, it endows the book with a general point of view that feeds into public understanding. In general, the depiction of the RVN in The Sympathizer tracks closely with the views of the Orthodox school. Quote, "Our politicians manage the shabby comic operetta of our country," the narrator opines, "an off-key travesty starring plump divas in white suits and mustachioed prima donnas in custom-tailored military uniforms," unquote. The highest-ranking RVN official in the novel, the general, is depicted as slavishly devoted to France and the United States. Quote, "a man who had faith in both the civilizing mission and the American way," unquote. Further underlying his comprador character, the general's opposition to communism is borrowed from abroad. It was, quote, "at Fort Benning in 1958 where Green Berets inoculated him permanently against communism," unquote. The narrator sees the real-life President Ngo Dinh Diem in a similar vein as a creature of foreign interests, referring to him as an American puppet who thought he was president. A devotion to foreigners defines ordinary citizens as well. Quote, "the atmosphere was strangely quiet in Saigon," the narrator explains, describing the city on the eve of its fall. "Most of the Saigonese citizenry behaving like people in a scuppered marriage, willing to cling gamely to each other and drown so long as nobody declared the adulterous truth. The truth in this case was that at least 1 million people were working or had worked for the Americans in one capacity or another, from shining their shoes to running the army designed by the Americans in their own image, to performing fellatio on them for the price in Peoria or Poughkeepsie of a hamburger." This is a fairly harsh representation, I would argue. After its fidelity to outsiders, the most prominent feature of the RVN in the novel is its corruption. Quote, "our society had been a kleptocracy of the highest order," the narrator explains, "the government doing its best to steal from the Americans, the average man doing his best to steal from the government, the worst of us doing our best to steal from each other. The ARVN, South Vietnamese military, is depicted as equally corrupt and venal, qualities that come to the fore where the narrator offers a handful of junior officers precious plane tickets out of the doomed city. Quote, "I summoned the 5 chosen officers for a very private meeting, one by one. 'We leave tonight?' asked the very nervous colonel, his eyes big and wet. 'Yes.' 'My parents? The parents of my wife?' asked the major. a crapulent devotee of the Chinese restaurants in Cholun? No. Brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews? No. Housekeepers and nannies? No. Suitcases, wardrobes, collections of china? No. The captain, who hobbled a bit because of venereal disease, threatened to commit suicide unless I found more seats. I offered him my revolver and he skulked off. In contrast, the young lieutenants were grateful. Having earned their precious positions via parental connections, they bore themselves with the herky-jerky nervousness of marionettes, unquote. Again, with all due respect, the absence of even a shred of empathy in this portrayal is, I think, remarkable. As their entire world crumbles around them, ARVN officers portrayed as either teary-eyed, venereal disease-infected, or gluttonous, obsess over the fate of their china collections and their servants. Worse than its corruption is ARVN's strangely violent posture towards its own people. Describing the fall of central Vietnam, the narrator says, quote, "We could not believe that Da Nang and Nha Trang had fallen, or that our troops had shot civilians in the back as they all fought madly to escape on boats and barges." Later, he describes southern Vietnamese boat refugees being robbed and raped by their own soldiers. He also bemoans ARVN's penchant for domestic political violence. Quote, "Our Air Force had bombed the presidential palace, our army had shot and stabbed to death our first president and his brother, and our bickering generals had fomented more coups d'etats than I could count," unquote. The novel's depiction of women and gender relations also follows orthodox tropes. As in many Hollywood Vietnam movies, the only female characters in the Saigon chapters are the corrupt wives of corrupt officials and prostitutes. A glimpse of, quote, "a covey of call girls vacuum packed into micro mini skirts and fishnet stockings named Mimi, Fifi, and Titi prompts an extended digression on this familiar topic. Quote, "Most were poor, illiterate country girls," the narrator explains, "with no means of making a living except to live as ticks on the fur of a 19-year-old American GI," unquote. While this depiction will be familiar to audiences of Full Metal Jacket and Platoon, it's actually not supported in recent scholarship on the history of Vietnamese sex work by young social scientists such as Kimberly Huang and the, alas, late Mai Lan Gustafson. The brilliant oral histories carried out by Gustafson in particular portray sex workers in Vietnam as much more sophisticated and ambivalent historical agents than the broad and frankly tired stereotypes about them found in Sympathizer. Also, as in many Hollywood movies, the novel features graphic sexual violence, including 2 gang rapes, one committed against a female communist agent by RVM policemen, and another committed by communist guerrillas on a young Southern woman. Differences in the portrayal of these episodes reveal the novel's relatively orthodox take on the relative capacity for depravity of each side in the Civil War. The rape perpetrated by the communists occurs as part of an Apocalypse Now style movie that occupies a big middle section of the narrative. Hence, it is actually not a real rape, rather it's a simulated rape devised by the director of the film, the auteur, as a piece of heavy-handed anti-communist propaganda. The narrator describes the scene briefly and figuratively as a writhing human octopus. On the other hand, the rape perpetrated by the ARVN policeman really happens and is genuinely shocking in the detail in which it's portrayed and in the depth of its moral depravity. Supervised by American advisors, 3 ARVN policemen take turns having violent, forced intercourse with a female communist agent. The novel details each assault, including a final, especially horrific one, in which the perpetrators penetrate the agent with a shaken-up, long-necked bottle of soda. It's striking how much of the sympathizer's portrait of war-era Saigon resembles orthodox American accounts. Corrupt, bickering, incompetent, puppets of foreign influence, the ARVN elite receives rough treatment in the novel. The sympathizer thematizes few of the important insights from the new scholarship concerning the complexity of Southern politics and the richness of Saigon's cultural and intellectual life. It pays less attention to the communist side, but its few communist characters, such as the watchman and the female prisoner, are cast in a rare, heroic light. There are no heroes on the Southern side, nor are there many characters that transcend the stereotypes brassy prostitutes, cowardly generals, corrupt officials found in orthodox English language representations. What's striking here, I think, is the overlap between the Burns-Novick film and Viet Thanh Nguyen novel in their stubborn fidelity to a dated, politically driven vision of the war and of the RVN. And what's really unfortunate, I think, is the huge reach of their influence relative to the scholarship. So, what is to be done here? Again, the basic problem is that advances in the scholarship are not trickling down into the broader public discourse. The Vietnam War, I think, is not the only historical issue marked by this kind of interpretive bifurcation. It may, however, be a relatively extreme example. So how might we think about combating this? It's something that I've been pondering for many years, and I still actually don't really know. One thing worth noting, I think, is that the evolution over time of the scholarship on Republicanism and the Republic of Vietnam might make us guardedly optimistic. It shows that change is possible, even though it may come slowly and fitfully in a kind of one step forward, two steps backward rhythm. In the scholarly literature, a changed view of republicanism in the RVN came into focus because of the efforts of two kinds of scholars: those who put their heads down and produced revisionist research, and those who attacked, sometimes quite forcefully, the old paradigm through reviews and historiographical polemics. New scholarly insights about republicanism and the Republic of Vietnam can be infused into the broader public discourse, I think, in the same way, through a combination of public-facing research and creative advocacy. Fortunately, we already have some interesting examples of both tactics. As forms of popularizing research, we have, for example, Alex Tai Vau's innovative web-based oral histories and Olga Dror's translation of Southern Vietnamese fiction. Examples of advocacy are weaker, I think, as evidenced by the relatively muted critical response to the political distortions of both the Burns film and The Sympathizer, but scholars such as Alec Holcomb, Keith Taylor, Hayden Cherry have already provided excellent examples within the field of aggressive reviewing and critical historiographical analysis. By building upon this small existing tradition, I am hopeful that we can influence broader perceptions of these critical historical questions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks a lot for sweeping and careful overview of republicanism, in the historical scholarship of Vietnam, and also, a great review of Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel. I really enjoyed it. I've never heard one like that. It's great. It's a great start for the workshop. We have time for about 10 minutes, time for questions. If anyone would like to ask Professor Zieneman's questions, please raise your hand. Then we pass the microphone to you.
Professor Zieneman, thank you very much for a very great review. You are very courageous to criticize a popular writer. This take a lot of bravery to do that. You asked the last question, what is to be done? I have one very simple answer. Publish your speech today. Thank you.
We will do it. Thank you.
My comment is only on the Sympathizer, and it's no wonder that he was educated at Berkeley. So, take it what it may. And the popularity of Viet Thanh Nguyen and his Pulitzer Prize winning on that comes from the fact that, to me, it's like a self-perpetuating tradition, or actually anti-war. You know, the people who celebrated him and his affinity with Ken Burns and Novak is no one else like some kind of an intellectual inbreeding that started with the anti-war movement and perpetuated here. Aside from that, of course, I was very struck by the novel itself, you know. And I must admit, I read it before it received the Pulitzer Prize. I have an added burden, or bonus, if you like, in matching the characters in his novel with the political scene between the 1970s and the end of the Saigon regime. You know? And especially character by character, I managed to, up to a fault, I guess, to match the character in real life with those in the book. And of course, I think he was alluded to Pham Son An, and I think the real sympathizer is based on the rather elusive character of this enigmatic double, triple, whatever you call him, agent. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to make a brief response to what you describe as sort of inbreeding, the novel has a funny acknowledgement section, which doesn't only list people who he thanks, but I think, you know, because he's a college professor and is, you know, also used to writing academic books, it includes something like a bibliography. He lists maybe 25 books that he says, books and articles he relied on for some of the historical context. And I was especially interested in this depiction of the fall of Saigon, and so I looked at what he cited, and it's really kind of amazing. I mean, it's, you know, journalistic accounts, English language journalistic accounts from the 1970s, people like James Fenton, you know, it's striking to me that there is a big Vietnamese language memoir literature, right, about what the fall of Saigon was like, what it was like subjectively for the people who experienced it. These are the characters in the novel. Why would one rely on this British journalist's outsider's view of that event? And I think a lot of the tone, you know, I couldn't track individual people, but some of the stories about, you know, the cars zooming through the streets of Saigon, and the, you know, sort of map of the city that people took on the way searching for flights, etc., was drawn directly from this, you know, really, I think, dated, crappy body of writing. I think it's a real, you know, to explain, you know, I don't really go into it in this talk to explain why this book has the character it does. I think that's an interesting question that would require a little bit of psychoanalysis, but also a study of his training, his background. I think Berkeley's not totally to blame, but I think it does play, his academic background does play a little role.
Peter?
Yeah, Paul?
So Peter, I think I really enjoy what you were saying. I think it you know, my impressions about the book and the documentary agree very much with that. If I may shift to a different question, what areas, you know, about Republican Vietnam, you know, I mean, I think with the large citation, you know, of names and scholars and so on, clearly I think studies about Republican Vietnam is growing a great deal. What areas do you think, you know, should scholars now and in the near future examine, and so on?
You know, a central point of the talk is there's sort of two different things that's meant by Republican Vietnam, sort of general Republican political tradition and the RVN itself. You know, for the general Republican political tradition, you know, in writing my last book on this one Vietnamese intellectual who I argue seems to be animated by this vision, I actually came to the conclusion that the person I was writing about was probably not the best manifestation of this, actually. And so I mentioned the research of my student Martino, who's looking for similar kinds of Republican ideas and impulses in the Duan movement. And those guys, they do actually publish manifestos, unlike Wu Chongfeng. They do write much more about the ebb and flow of policy towards representative, quasi-democratic bodies during the colonial period. They do pursue sort of social welfareist kinds of programs, the Einsang movement, for example, that really seems like they're influenced by, based on things going on amongst Republicans in Third Republic France. My hope is that my work and Martino's work is sort of just the beginning, and that some of these other individuals will also be subject to similar kinds of research. Fan Hoi, this is a guy who's crying out for a dissertation to be written on him. All of his writing has been comprehensively and brilliantly annotated and collected by the Hanoi-based literary scholar Lai Guanan. It's the easiest dissertation there could be to write. You just got to buy those 15 volumes, read them closely, organize it in some way. He's an incredible figure. I've talked to about this idea, and he says, he really sees, you can see in all these different aspects of his writing, even though Fan Hoi never considers himself, never calls himself a Republican, the impulse seems to be more pointed in his writing than in Chongfeng, or maybe even Martino's writing about. So, I don't know, I used to be much more optimistic and think that, eventually the field is going to catch up and we're going to start to, there's all these unstudied intellectuals and their huge bodies of work, and eventually people will start to take them on. Now I wonder whether we've got the numbers to do that. I would love to see some other individuals. Individual studies, single person studies is only one way to go about it, but I think it's kind of a building block to then come to a greater sort of conclusion about, how significant is this movement? And, in reference to sort of Thornton's last slide, how significant is this movement relative to support for the communists or support for other kinds of political movements during the era? On the Republic of Vietnam, again, I think it's a wide open field. And one thing I would say is that I think the Diem decade is getting now what we might think of as sort of adequate attention from a lot of different angles, from a lot of different kinds of people. It's not possible. And I think you actually see this in the Burns film. And the Burns film commits a lot of these old kind of errors, but there's sort of too much scholarship on the Diem period for him to totally depict it in the way that it was in the past. I don't think that's the case for post-63 governments. The interregnum between Diem and Q and Key, I think, is still sort of, what do we know about it? It's a revolving door of generals, right? Who's really taken that period, that couple-year period, and sort of looked at social history, cultural history, the high political history? I think some of the papers that have been submitted for this conference show that we really don't even have, or we're only starting to have good scholarship on the political history of things like, the anti-Bao Dai referendum, in Nguyen's paper. It's the first time I've really seen sort of breakdown of domestic politics over that. I don't know exactly where to start. It's a lot of different stuff to do. I think there are a lot of, some of the work that's been done already by people like Sean Fear and Jason Gibbs, for example, on these later periods. It's done by people who have a lot of knowledge and talent and represent, I think, a really good base going forward.
Thanks a lot. The next 2 days we're going to have a lot of this. The next panel in particular has a paper on Trần Trọng Kim, prominent figure that has been so long neglected. And if you have time, read that paper. And I'm glad that Dr. Khoi over there listened to my suggestion to carry out research over the last year, and he's already got almost a full manuscript to be published on Trần Trọng Kim's ideas. And then we also want to have, like a paper on the Santa, on Wat Khoa group, and also on. So like a lot of stuff is going on that front. There's a question over there. We may have time for just one more question.
Peter, thanks for this very inspiring talk. I just want to make one comment on your Ken Burns, Lynn Novick critique. I think no Vietnamese faction involved in the civil strife will be happy with their treatment in the Burns-Novick film. But particularly the first episode is one of the worst, I think, historical attempts to depict history in recent documentary history, subjecting the very complexity of Vietnamese history to 75 minutes and leading to 1961. I think what we find is also not only the caricaturing of the Republic, the non-mention of the Associated State of Vietnam, the non-mention of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. It's also a caricature of the communist or revolutionary movement. And I think that the deeper issue with Burns-Novick is that their deep disinterest in an accurate depiction and inclusion of Vietnamese voices from all sides. They are adorning their film with Vietnamese heads, talking heads, but without really taking them seriously. And I think that applies to all sides. So that's my only comment to your.
Yeah, just a quick response, because someone mentioned earlier that there's not been a lot of criticism of the sympathizer, but there actually has been a lot of criticism of the Ken Burns film. If you look at especially Vietnamese American critics writing in English in the English language press, they've actually been quite tough on it. And there's some, I think, very, very tough reviews coming out of Vietnam. A lot of it's on Facebook and stuff, but people have, really, they haven't shied away from the criticism. And I think the fact that the strongest criticism tends to be coming from these Vietnamese American voices supports what you're saying. The absence of criticism for the Viet Thanh Nguyen novel and the fact that criticizing that might be seen as an odd or grave thing, I think, requires further thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's time to move on. Thank you so much for your talk. Please join me to
Thank you.